Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Diane, for the invitation to speak to you here for the opening of the exhibition this afternoon. Thank you to Karina and her team for everything that you've done to put this exhibition hanging here so beautifully. And thank you to each of you. A lot of you have travelled quite a distance today, and thank you for coming to be with us this afternoon. Today is a very special day because it would have been my mum's 75th birthday. And she was a quilter extraordinaire. She really naturally came to do it through, she was initially a stretch sewing teacher, you know, Netwood in the 80s. And she was invited along to a patchwork class. And she became addicted. So she put aside the clothes sewing and started cutting up fabric, sewing it back together again, and making incredible quilts. So Mum taught me to sew, and one of my earliest memories is of us both sitting in her sewing room. Mum was with her favourite friend, her Benina, and I was at a little toy plastic sewing machine, and all it could do was punch holes in paper. So that's where my sewing started, and then Mum taught me to sew my clothes, and once she started doing the patchwork, I just followed suit. My mum was very skilled and naturally talented with the use of colour and design, and she loved the traditional work, so the log cabin, the hexagons, the triangles, the diamonds, and she became the person to beat in the show in Zimbabwe when we lived there. However, I lack the patience for traditional work, and I'm not accurate in cutting or sewing. I once made a hen and chicks pattern. Those of you familiar with that would know that that is made up of squares and triangles all have lots of points. And to look good, they need to meet. At least 20% of my corners were stubs. So I had to hide them somehow. So I embellished them with beads, applique, a little bit of embroidery, and it turned into what in those days was called an innovative quilt in Zimbabwe. And I found myself firmly on the road to making art quilts. Diane had asked me to talk about making wool quilts, and to ask the question, why not make wool quilts? When we first ask that question, we might think about using wool fabric, that's for garments, and using it in our traditional methods, so log cabin, sewing patchwork squares, even diamonds, or doing a pictorial landscape using that sort of fabric. This doesn't appeal to me, of course, because I can't cut or sew straight, and it would be even harder with the thicker fabric of the wool. However, I discovered, quite by accident, a different way of using wool. Here in Australia, Mum and I went to a Benina Club meeting where they demonstrate different products that they have. There is an embellishing machine on the market which doesn't sew two pieces of fabric together. It's got barbed needles, and when you use the machine, the needles go up and down at speed, and they go through fibre and cause the fibres to mesh together to create a new piece of fabric, essentially. And Benina created an attachment for the machine that could do the same thing. So I was quite impressed with this tool, and I probably bought one. And I then needed to buy some wool roving to use with it. So wool roving is wool that has been washed and carded so that all the fibres are facing the same way. So it becomes an evenly distributed rope of fibre, and then of course it's dyed fabulous colours. And I distinctly remember driving home from that meeting and Mum telling me about wet felting. And she told me that people use this wool roving and they lay out layers of fibre, and they wet it with hot soapy water, and they roll it hundreds of times. And I screwed up my nose and said, who on earth would want to do that? It did not appeal at all. However, I needed to find some roving. So I went to Threads and More, sadly it doesn't exist in Brisbane anymore, the shop, and to buy my roving. And in the shop, I found a sample of wet felting. And it was stunning. So, lucky for me, they had a workshop 2 weeks later, so I signed up. And I went along, and I wasn't even halfway through when I texted my mum to say, I'm addicted. And when I think back about why I had such a reaction, it's really hard for me to put it into words as to why I did have that reaction. I think I loved the texture of the wool and the silk. I loved the colours, and I also loved a relatively quick process of making it. So this is the piece that I did on that workshop. So this was done with the red merino wool, 2 layers as the background, and then these are silk hankies. I'll explain those a little bit later. This is what's called silk tops. There is some wool yarn and some synthetic yarn as well. And at the workshop I learned that the wool shrinks by 30%. And I learned that the silk doesn't shrink. So by not shrinking on the surface, we get these beautiful textures of the silk and the wool underneath shrinks. I'll pass this around and have a feel of wool weaving. Many animal fibres will felt. Anything from camel to yak, Angora rabbit, even your dog and cat fur will felt. And it is the sheep's merino wool, however, that is the best, because the wool has tiny scales on the outside of the fibre. And when we wet them, those scales lift up, and we move the fibres through agitation, and the fibres will naturally move towards their root, which is going with the scales. And then when we move them the other way, those scales will open up and start to catch on other fibres. And then they get caught, they can't move so much anymore, they lose their elasticity, and then the felt becomes stronger. When we wet the fibres, we are trying to remove the air that is between them. And when all of that air is removed, those fibres become locked down, and the fibre becomes strong and very dense. So this process that first horrified me requires the laying out of the wool in usually 2 layers, 90 degrees to each other, on bubble wrap, because that has a large surface area. On top of that, we lay our silk hankies and silk tops, the synthetic and the natural yarn as well. And then on top of that, we would put a layer of tulle. That needs to hold everything down while you wet it. You also don't want to sneeze before it's wet, because that will move everything. The silk hanky is nothing like what we think of a hanky. It is one silk cocoon that is pulled out into a square. So here we've got a whole pile of silk hankies, dyed absolutely incredible colours.
Wow.
So that's one silk hanky, one cocoon pulled out into a square. So it's very sheer, very shiny, very soft. And then the way we lay that, you pinch it and lay it like that, you can create flowers and all sorts of shapes. And then of course that silk doesn't shrink as the wool beneath it does. So we lay everything down, we put our silk embellishment on the top, layer of tulle, wet it down with hot soapy water, and then we roll it up. I tend to use a dowel, and then do 100 rolls, and then carefully pull off the tulle. It needs to come off at that point, otherwise the wool will start to move through the tulle and it will become stuck, which we don't want. And then we turn the work 90 degrees, roll it up again, and roll another 100 rolls. Undo it, turn it 90, roll it up, and another 100 rolls. And you roll for an hour and a half to 2 hours. When we see that the wool between our fingers, our thumb and our forefinger, is no longer moving, then we know that the rolling stage is complete. Those fibres are locked together and it's very strong. So the next stage is the fulling stage, and that's where most of the shrinkage takes place. It seems quite an aggressive thing to do. You have the bubble wrap with the bubble side up, you pull your wool together, it is a whole piece, it's not moving, it's solid, and you literally throw it from a height onto the bubble wrap. That shocks the fibres, causing them to shrink and making your work very strong. If you've ever accidentally put a woolen jumper into the washing machine, on the wrong cycle. And it comes out much smaller, much less stretchy. It may even be stuck together in parts. That your washing machine has done the fulling process for you. There's no way to reverse that. So with my new addiction, I made hundreds of scarves and decorative pieces like that one to put on canvas. But being a quilter, I had an urge to turn it into quilts. The simplest way to do that was to mount the fabric, the felt onto a piece of fabric and then quilt it like a normal quilt. At that time, the definition with Queensland quilters of a quilt was that it had to be 3 layers and it had to have stitching all the way through. And that really made it a little bit more tricky for me to do the work the way I wanted to. So this is one of the first ones that I did do and enter into the show at that time. So this is poppy field, the gradated green wool for the background, 2 layers. Each poppy is 1 silk hanky. The stamens are made with synthetic yarn. And then other wool yarn here and also synthetic yarn for the stems. And I extended some of those into the border and then used that embellishing tool on the machine to felt them through so that they would go through. This bamboo piece called tie-bye was done in the same way. 2 layers of green merino for the background, and then I used these pieces of wool, so they were just long pieces that were naturally dyed that way to represent the bamboo, and then I added some silk tops, and then this is actually a banana fibre, just to add some definition there. Again, I used the embellishing tool down the bottom to extend the felt work into the cotton border, and that had to be our 3 layers. This is another one done in a very similar way. This was for the Australasian Quilt Convention. Each year they have a challenge that is 90 centimetres square apiece. The theme for 2019 was magic. My day job that allows me to buy the roving is to teach children with dyslexia. And I always teach them a little bit about very basic neuroplasticity and how their brains work. So each silk hanky is a neuron. And then we've got the sometimes silk tops or yarn, synthetic yarn, as the neural connections. And I teach the children, the reason I ask them to do it again and again and again is because we need to build those neural connections. And then it was quilted to outline the neurons, and then there's also some neurons quilted in the background that you can't see unless you are close up to that one. So the 3-layer rule made some of my quilts a bit tricky to quilt, especially by hand quilting, which is what I used to love to do. I don't have the time for that so much anymore. But the 3 layers made it really hard to get the delicate stitches that I was used to on cotton quilts. With this piece, I didn't want to have a binding, so I used the natural edge of the felted piece that I created, and I needed to be inventive with my backing there and tuck it under. There's 3 layers here. The middle layer is fine cotton muslin, as lightweight as I could find. The animals were cut out of silk and laid down. This is all the silk tops. And as the felting process progressed, quite a lot of the fibre, you can see it when you look close up, has come from behind the silk, has come through. The little guinea fowl at the bottom, they were quite fun. I cut out circles from the silk for the background wool to come through to suggest their little spots on their feathers. These pieces were felted separately and then embellished on using the tool, and the same with the hanging sleeve. And then this African one was even more of a challenge. Remember, the wool shrinks by 30%, so that Africa was enormous when I started. And I used 3 layers of black wool for that. My initial intention was to have that as the whole piece, and so it was shaped in the shape of Africa. I didn't want it to be mounted on something, but it had to happen that way. Because of the difficulty of hanging it, especially in the Queensland Quilter show, things like that, I had to mount it up. So I used 3 layers of the black merino, and then this is a lot of the silk hankies for the desert. This is silk tops for the vegetation of the equatorial section. I used this, it's actually a synthetic yarn, but it felted very much like a natural wool yarn for the major rivers on the continent. I collected the buttons over a period of time to use, and then embellished it with lots of beads just to give it that very ethnic feel. Then I mounted it onto the hessian to add to that texture, raw edge applique from really stunning African fabrics. And then I used a bit of discharge line up there, so that's using bleach on black fabric. And then had to quilt it. This is also tied. I couldn't quilt this, so it's got ties that hold it through the batting to the backing sporadically through. So the wet felting technique lends itself to creating abstract as well as pictorial work. And when we use sheer cloth, so gauze, silk gauze or muslin, something like that, lightweight habitat, together with the wool we can be even more creative, creating what is called Nuno Felt. This technique was developed by the Australian artist Polly Sterling, and the name of it comes from the Japanese word Nuno, which means cloth. So this usually consists of one fine layer of silk with one fine layer of the wool. When we lay the wool for Nuno felting, we wouldn't lay the fibres all going in the same direction because they would shrink in one way, and we need even shrinkage to get the beautiful ruching. So in that instance, we put the fibres as a herringbone crossing over so that we get even shrinkage. So this is an example, this is a work in progress of Nuno Felting, but it's trying very hard to be quite a traditional quilt. With some applique, even some sashing. So I started with white silk. This was white tissue silk with white wool. And then I dyed it using special wool and silk dyes that you work from the microwave. And then I cut out the love hearts, did an applique of them on different blocks, stitched them together. I still need to do a little bit more stitching in places before I do the next stage of more rolling and then the fulling of that. So the silk at times will take the dye even better than the wool does. So we can move them into eco-dyeing and eco-printing. This piece is classified as a pre-felt. It's got one fine layer of the merino wool on this side, with the fibres in different angles, and tissue silk on this side. As a pre-felt, it was only rolled about 400 times, just enough for the wool fibres to start to join together and start moving through the silk. I then rinsed it, dried it, and then laid the gum leaves on top and tied it around a eucalyptus stick, holding it down tight with the string, which is at these lines. The tighter it is, the better the print is of the leaf onto both the silk and the wool. I use iron as the mordant for this one. A mordant is a substance that helps the dye to combine with the textile. So we can use iron, as I did here, or we can also use copper, which gives more of an amber colour. So this still needs to be felted a lot more. So I could put it onto another layer of wool and work it. I could stitch it to another piece and then just continue to felt it as it is, and it would be quite fine and quite sheer. It's worth noting, if you are going to do eco-dyeing and eco-printing, that the colours you will get now are very different to these colours because of the weather that we've had. We've had so much rain that the colour coming from the leaves will be very muted. Right now it will be hard to get good prints off the leaves. In addition to using plants for natural dyeing with the silk and the wool, we can also use cyanotypes. In 1843, Anna Atkins was the first person to use plant specimens with the cyanotypes on photosensitive paper. And her publication of her detailed specimens using cyanotypes led her to be considered the first female photographer. An increasing number of artists are using cyanotypes now on both paper and fabric. It's very simple to do it. You get two chemicals mixed together. You will paint them onto a fabric. It needs to be a natural fibre, so linen, cotton, silk. And then it needs to dry in a dark room, no light whatsoever. And then it will, once it's dry, you can lay it down and put a photo negative printed onto acetate, or plants, leaves, anything that's going to be able to resist and block the sun from reaching the fabric. Then you put a layer of glass on top and put it in the sun. Depending on the amount of UV that we have at the time, it could take 15 to 20 minutes for that photosensitive reaction to take place. And when you see the dark area exposed to the sun go white, it's done its thing. You would take it inside and then carefully lift everything off. The water will stop that photosensitive reaction from taking place, so you would rinse it quickly and then dry it. This is an example. This is Mum's portrait, using cyanotypes onto a very fine silk. And then around the outside are some flowers, and then this piece here is actually a piece of her own handmade lace that she made. So this is a way where we can get very defined images when we're using wool, which otherwise might be a bit tricky. So that was a practice, and then this is a finished felted work, portrait of Mum. So the cyanotype there, using some other silk and other wool. Then I did the same process for a portrait of our family cat, Mally. I do have another cat called Shumba, but he doesn't sit still long enough to get a good photo. So while I discovered the wet felting by accident, there are legends from around the world about how felting was discovered. A Sumerian legend from southern Mesopotamia claims that Ernaman of Lagash discovered it. However, that is not a real human, so it wasn't him. European legend claims it was discovered by different saints, and according to what you read, it's either Saint Clement, Saint James, or Saint Christopher. And the theory is that they put wool inside their shoes when they were either on pilgrimage or fleeing persecution to stop blisters. And their feet obviously sweated, and that moisture, with the agitation of their foot moving in the shoe, caused the fibres to felt. And at the end of the journey, they would have had very snug woolen socks, which were felted. However, it couldn't have been those men either, because in Turkey, the remains of felt have been found dating back long before then, back to 6,500 BC. The National Wool Museum had an exhibition earlier this year called Necessity, Woggers and the Art of Making Do. And as an immigrant, I didn't know what a wogger was. I knew Wagga Wagga, and I'd been there, but I had no idea what a wogger was. I had to do some research. So it is a blanket or bed covering made out of sacks from flour and like stitched together to make a blanket to keep people warm, also known as a bushman's blanket. So these woggers were born out of necessity. The pioneering men in the 1890s and the early 1900s didn't have the ability to buy anything new, so they had to use what they had to make ways to keep themselves warm. Over time, women used calico flour bags instead of the hessian bags because they were a bit softer. And they also added fabric swatches, a lot of which were wool. So these woggers epitomise the we'll make do and she'll be right attitude of Australia. And the National Wool Museum holds one of Australia's largest and most significant public collections of both quilts and woggers. So it includes 24 quilts, 25 woggers, 9 expressions of the Wool Quilt Prize winners that Diane mentioned earlier, 2 rugs and 2 tapestries. On your next trip to Melbourne, please visit the National Wool Museum. The team at the museum wants to preserve and share our Australian heritage in quilts, and they invite us as the community to dig out heritage quilts and woggers that might be hiding in our cupboards and our attics. The original workers came out of having to make do because they weren't able to buy something new. And I've been contemplating this recently and seeing how many artists are starting to make do in that way, but by choice, because of the environmental impact of things. They're choosing to reuse, recycle, repurpose blankets and clothing to make their quilts. So our Australian wool is the cornerstone of the global wool textile trade, and over 90% of the world's wool apparel fabric comes from Australian wool, and that is used to create the finest suits, luxurious homewares, baby wear, even sportswear and shoes these days. And Australia is investing in new consumer product innovations, including shoes. The Athletic Propulsion Labs running shoes feature 80% merino wool on the upper of the shoe. We're using superfine merino knitwear for sufferers of dermatitis. Clinical trials have shown that our merino sleepwear has shown to improve quality of sleep because it helps to regulate the body temperature. And merino knit, being fire resistant, is used as undergarments for fire personnel, military and police. And as we all are becoming more conscious of the environmental impact of our lives, we need to talk about the aspects of wool production. Unfortunately, like anything, there are things that are harmful, such as the sheep themselves do produce a large amount of methane gas. The wool cleaning treatment uses harmful chemicals that must be disposed of carefully. And the dyeing process uses large quantities of water. However, in my research I discovered something I knew nothing about, and that is biogenic carbon. That is carbon that is part of the natural cycle. It is living matter that's been absorbed by something that is alive through its life. So the biogenic carbon of wool is 50% of its weight, and the biogenic carbon of cotton is only 40%. So you can choose wool. And our synthetic materials are taking up very precious space in landfill, and they are going to take hundreds of thousands of years to degrade. Studies have shown that merino wool biodegrades quite quickly back into the soil. It will naturally degrade in about 4 months under normal conditions, and even faster in a warm and moist environment. And that's because it's made up of keratin, just like our fingernails. So bacteria and fungi will feast on that protein down to the building blocks and then release into the natural soil again nitrogen, magnesium and sulfur for the plants to use. I didn't know that some cultures have actually been using merino wool for fertilizer for centuries. As Diane mentioned earlier, Ozquilt Network aims to raise the profile and status of the art quilters, art quilts and art quilt making in Australia. And the network does this through 2 main exhibitions currently. These exhibitions aim to display work of the highest quality, encourage understanding of the art quilt movement, and to promote the collection of art quilts. One of these exhibitions is our Australia-wide 8, which we're going to open shortly. And then the other one is the Art Quilt Australia exhibition that first took place in 2009. It's juried and judged and open to all residents of Australia and New Zealand. And it includes the Expressions the Wool Quilt Prize, with the winning quilt being acquired by the National Quilt Museum. So I encourage you to visit the Ozquilt Network website. There you will see exhibitions from previous years and how different artists have used wool in diverse ways. So to mention just a few, Lisa Davis used 100% wool fabric with raw edge machine applique to create her work, The Art of Record Keeping, in 2015. Beth and Trevor Reed, who have work here today, used piecing of hand-dyed wool, gabardine, together with hand drawing on wool and painting to create vignettes in 2015. Sue Reed used wool fabric with fabric paint and metallic thread and wool quilting thread to create her piece, Clint Print No. 2. Carolyn Sullivan used needle felting together with applique and machine and hand stitching to create Red Grasses in 2017. And in the same year, Anna Brown used silk screen printing on wool, I would have never thought of that, to create her piece Canopy 6. And in 2019, Diane Firth used wool blanket with wool dressmaking fabric with a technique of whole cloth with bound incisions to create her piece From the Sea. Last year, Fiona Gabbins used felted wool and woven alpaca wool and yarns to create Ghost Blanket 4. So I hope that I've opened your eyes to see what can be done with wool. The possibilities are endless. We can repurpose woolen clothing and blankets, use wool apparel fabric in more traditional ways, use needle felting, and those crazy enough to roll bubble wrap for hours can create wet felted work. So when we use our wool, whether it's merino, alpaca, camel hair, angora, even cat and dog fur, we can use a beautiful natural resource to fulfill our own need to create, to produce stunning art quilts for other people to enjoy. And one of them may one day hang in the National Wool Museum 100 years from now. Thank you.
The other question I wanted to ask you is, you're doing this rolling roll. Do you have a counter, counting up to 100? Or, you know, it might be very...
That's a good question.
It might be therapeutic, and you might say, this is better than going to the gym. Okay.
Unfortunately, it doesn't do anything that the gym would do. If you end up needing a chiropractor from your rolling, it means you're doing it wrong. It shouldn't be any pressure. It is just moving it so that it moves gently. We naturally think if I do it harder and faster, then it will felt faster, but that's not the case. You end up with a sore neck. So I do lose count. So what I often do is I have great music going, and I put a timer on now. I time how long it takes me to do the 100 rolls, and put that on the timer. And then I can just enjoy the music or thinking about what I'm thinking about, and don't have to count.
Brenda, did you have a question?
I was just going to say, what's your next project for wool? Are you going to continue with wool felting? Are you going to use wool, recycled wool? What's your next direction?
What's the question, Brenda?
I know.
It's so funny. In preparing for this, I thought, oh, I need to use more wool. So I stocked up on my wool recently, and I've been working on a couple of pieces for next year. And I think I'm more into creating from raw wool moving forward than going into the recycling just at the moment. But anything could happen.
So following on for that, as a process, so I'm coming, you know, from my perspective, I'm wanting to have fantastic things for exhibitions, like beautiful artwork. And we hear from Julie of this long process. She makes her cloth and then makes beautiful art. So my question is, how do you know what's going to end up, or is it something that just evolves? You're making this felted piece, and through that slow making, you see its opportunities. So it becomes very personal. Mm-hmm. And do you get to the stage of saying, I can see this moving into another form, which will end up being an art quilt? Is that the way it goes?
I think I have an unusual process of doing it in some ways because I don't do much drawing out and planning. I do a lot of thinking in my head. That one was in my head for 18 months before I actually got to start it. But I didn't at any stage draw out and plan and write down, I'm going to use silk hankies for this, and I'm going to do the beading and have the buttons and do this in this way. So it's very much, it's in there because I want to make it. Some of you would know my elephant quilt. That was in my head for 2 years. I saw the photo and I wanted to do something based on that, and it took me 2 years to do it, to start. But then once I started, it was really quick. And this process of felting is very quick. So for the neuroplastic magic, for the whole theme of magic, I thought, oh, let's do the neurons. And I didn't give it too much thought as to how I'll actually do it. I just got the wool out, felted that piece in 3 hours, and then it had to dry, and then the quilting maybe took 2 hours, binding, done. So I like the fact that that is so quick, relative to a lot of the other more traditional ways of doing things.
But you could only do this because you had all of those techniques under control, and you had a great idea, and it's the idea, and you had the ability to turn it into...
Just a few weeks ago I started working on another piece that is felted, and in my head I had the idea of what I wanted to do, and I made sure that I had the right colour walls that I needed. But then when I started to do it, it just wasn't quite happening how I wanted it to happen. But then I found some of that leftovers from another piece, that silk dyed with eucalyptus, and that then suited that project.
Yes.
So it took a bit of a different angle then.
Yeah.
And I have to say, felting that was just glorious because it had a eucalyptus smell. It was just delicious. And so that evolved differently. So everything is different.
Yeah.
But I'm not a very good planner and writing things down sort of person.
No more questions? So I think we might draw this to a close. And I feel so privileged. I want to thank you so much for that. You've taken us through your journey. You've educated us. The research you've done on this and shared with us has been really, really interesting. You know, I'm keep thinking of those saints with their linings on their boots, and then of course they have to claim that they've discovered it. But that finding that it was there in those Turkish excavations, did you say 6,000 years?
6,500 years.
It's incredible that it was, and no mention of women. Right? So, you know, the women were probably doing a lot of the work, and, you know, can only just wonder. Anyway, I think we've all had a wonderful exploration of wood and its use and how it can be converted to artwork. But more than that, it's the joy of making. It's the joy of creating, whether it turns into a work that's going to be in a gallery or not, doesn't matter. It's our personal development and the satisfaction from what we do. And it's only now that we're starting to recognise that women are there doing this. And you're a very important woman to this, very important work. So thank you, and I'd like you to show you.